June 6, 1944, on the shores of Normandy. A tank, identified as Fury, sustained a direct impact. Its occupants evacuated. The operation concluded, save for one individual's unwillingness to depart. Sergeant Curtis Cullen lacked formal engineering credentials and specialized instruction. His approach was unconventional, relying on salvaged materials and a welding apparatus. His superior deemed his concept preposterous. Yet, the device he constructed within 2 days would profoundly alter the course of the invasion. A single disabled tank, a solitary, audacious mechanic, and an innovation so elemental, so ingenious, that General Eisenhower himself mandated the production of 5,000 units. This is the narrative omitted from conventional historical accounts. The chronicle of how a sergeant with a cutting torch instrumentalized D-Day's triumph. Remain engaged to witness the subsequent astounding developments. Normandy, France, June of 1944, precisely 6 days post D-Day, and the Allied forces' progression had effectively stagnated. The impediment wasn't German armaments nor artillery barrages, but rather the hedgerows. These were not the ornamental plantings one might cultivate in a private garden. The hedgerows of Normandy represented ancient fortifications, substantial earthworks interwoven with stone and tenacious roots, meticulously erected by generations of farmers to delineate property lines. Some attained a height of 15 feet and were equally substantial in width. Their root systems extended 10 feet or more into the soil. Functioning as natural bastions, they crisscrossed Normandy like an intricate labyrinth. For the American tank crews, these hedgerows transformed into lethal traps. Each attempt by a Sherman tank to surmount a hedgerow exposed its thinly armored underside, the most vulnerable aspect of the entire armored vehicle. German soldiers strategically positioned on the opposite side, armed with anti-tank weaponry, would patiently await. The instant a Sherman's undercarriage became visible, they would unleash their fire. A single shot, a solitary vanquished tank. Repeatedly, Sergeant Curtis Cullen, a member of the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron, witnessed this tragic spectacle unfold day after day. He observed tanks approach a hedgerow, tilt upwards in their ascent, and subsequently erupt in flames. The crews seldom survived. Those who did emerged traumatized, physically scarred, or both. Medical personnel were inundated. The mortuary service operated at maximum capacity. The tactical predicament was dire. Allied strategists had anticipated reaching a point 30 miles inland by this juncture, advancing towards Paris. Instead, they found themselves ensnared within a dense network of hedgerows, achieving mere hundreds of yards of progress daily. Each parcel of land presented a distinct engagement. Each hedgerow posed a novel challenge. The German forces required no substantial reinforcements. Their strategy consisted of utilizing these natural fortifications as cover, systematically neutralizing American armor as it inadvertently exposed itself. Cullen possessed no engineering background. He had not pursued higher education. Prior to the conflict, his occupation involved servicing automobiles and trucks as a mechanic in New Jersey. However, he possessed a profound understanding of mechanical principles, of forces and their application. As he witnessed yet another Sherman engulfed in flames after attempting to traverse a hedgerow, a pivotal realization struck him. The core issue wasn't the hedgerows themselves, but rather the method of engagement. Tanks were attempting to surmount them, not penetrate them. If a means could be devised to cleave through the hedgerow at ground level, to plow through its substance rather than ascend it, the tank would never expose its vulnerable belly plating. The German defenders would be unable to target what remained concealed. But how does one sever through 10 feet of compacted earth, stone, and interwoven roots? These hedgerows had endured centuries of environmental exposure. They would not yield to anything less than immense force applied with precision. Cullen commenced sketching concepts in a notebook he invariably carried. His fellow soldiers regarded his endeavors with amusement. "Cullen's at it again," they jest. He's going to solve the entire war with his little drawings. Their sentiment was affectionate, yet tinged with skepticism. Numerous intelligent individuals had grappled with the hedgerow dilemma, none successfully resolving it. What prompted a mere sergeant to believe he could surmount this obstacle? Cullen disregarded the pervasive doubt. He had long since recognized that mechanics were frequently underestimated. There was a prevailing assumption that manual laborers lacked intellectual capacity. However, every proficient mechanic is fundamentally a problem solver. Each repair presents a puzzle. One learns to discern operational mechanics, the interplay of forces, and the techniques required to compel recalcitrant machinery into compliance. The hedgerows were merely another form of obstinate machinery. They simply required a persuasive approach, and Cullen was convinced he had devised one. All he required was a disabled tank, some scrap metal, and the authorization of an officer sufficiently daring to sanction his attempt. Sergeant Cullen approached his commanding officer, Captain Samuel Morrison, with a proposal that sounded utterly irrational. He intended to repurpose a damaged Sherman tank, one that had sustained damage but remained operational, by affixing steel prongs to its frontal chassis. These prongs, fabricated from discarded German anti-tank obstacles known as Czech hedgehogs scattered liberally across the Normandy beaches, would function as formidable cutting implements. The tank would then be driven at full velocity into the hedgerows, with the prongs designed to embed themselves and tear through the earth and roots, thereby creating a passage. Captain Morrison regarded Cullen with an expression of disbelief. "Sergeant, allow me to confirm my understanding. You propose to take a tank that has already been engaged, attach scrap metal to it, and then deliberately propel it at maximum speed into a solid earthen embankment? Is that your strategy?" "Affirmative, sir," Cullen responded calmly. "The current approach involves driving tanks over hedgerows, where their undersides become exposed to enemy fire. My proposed method ensures the frontal armor remains consistently oriented towards the adversary. The Germans cannot penetrate the frontal armor. Their objective is the belly shot. By denying them this opportunity, we prevent tank destruction." Morrison remained silent for a considerable duration. The logical framework was sound, yet the execution remained audacious. Modifying tanks in a combat theater, employing untested equipment in active engagement? Should it fail, valuable tanks and personnel would be lost. Conversely, should it succeed, well, if it proves effective, we might finally achieve significant progress. "What time frame do you anticipate for its construction?" Morrison inquired. "Grant me 2 days, welding apparatus, and authorization to procure materials from the beach obstacles. I shall deliver a functional prototype." Morrison rendered a decision that would irrevocably alter the trajectory of the Normandy campaign. "You are allotted 48 hours. Should this endeavor prove unsuccessful, we shall both face considerable scrutiny from highly displeased generals." Cullen rendered a salute and immediately commenced his work. He requisitioned an acetylene torch, welding equipment, and a specialized crew. Subsequently, he proceeded to the beaches where the initial D-Day landings had occurred. These beaches were now strewn with German defensive emplacements, obstacles originally intended to impede Allied landing craft, but largely circumvented during the initial assault. The Czech hedgehogs proved perfectly suited for Cullen's requirements. These were formidable steel anti-tank barriers, constructed from 3 robust iron beams welded together in a configuration resembling a colossal jack, akin to an oversized children's toy, yet fashioned from hardened steel and weighing hundreds of pounds. The Germans had deployed thousands of these devices along the beaches, ostensibly to halt tanks and landing craft. Instead, they had become a readily available source of scrap metal for repurposing. Cullen and his team meticulously cut apart the hedgehogs using torches. Working through the night, they shaped the steel beams to the desired length, approximately 4 feet. They sharpened their extremities and reinforced the welded joints. By the conclusion of the first day, 4 prongs were meticulously prepared, each possessing a girth comparable to a man's leg and a hardness akin to railroad track. The subsequent phase demanded greater finesse. The objective was to affix these prongs to the front of a Sherman tank without compromising the tank's structural integrity or impeding its mobility. Cullen meticulously calculated the angles and placement. The prongs needed to be positioned low enough to effectively engage the base of the hedgerow, spaced adequately to traverse a substantial width, and robust enough to withstand impact without fracturing. "Do you genuinely believe this will be effective?" inquired Private Eddie Kowalski, one of the welders assisting with the project. "I am certain of its efficacy," Cullen replied, adjusting his welding mask. "The underlying physics are sound. Steel projections propelled by 30 tons of tank force impacting earth and roots. Something must yield, and it will not be the steel." By dawn on the second day, the modification was complete. The Sherman tank now bore 4 steel prongs extending from its front, reminiscent of the formidable tusks of some colossal mechanical creature. Soldiers congregated to observe the peculiar contraption. Some expressed admiration, while others remained unconvinced. A considerable number placed wagers on whether Cullen would face a court-martial or receive commendation. "It resembles a boar attempting to engage a porcupine," quipped one soldier. Cullen affectionately patted a steel prong. "Perhaps so, but this boar is about to root its way through every hedgerow between here and Berlin." Captain Morrison meticulously examined the modified tank, scrutinizing the welds and assessing the strength of the prongs. Finally, he nodded. "Very well, Sergeant. You have constructed your ingenious device. Now you must demonstrate its capability. Tomorrow morning, we shall locate a suitably formidable hedgerow and ascertain whether this contraption represents genius or sheer folly." That night, Cullen found himself unable to sleep. He mentally replayed the calculations repeatedly. The mathematics were sound. The engineering principles were robust. However, a distinction existed between theoretical postulation and practical application. What if the prongs fractured upon impact? What if they embedded themselves too deeply, immobilizing the tank? What if the entire audacious assembly exacerbated the existing predicament? Yet he recollected the image of those burning Shermans, the crews who never escaped. He contemplated how the hedgerows were transforming Normandy into a charnel house for American armor. A change was imperative. And if his concept proved viable, it held the potential to preserve hundreds of lives. Tomorrow would provide the definitive answer. As the morning sun had barely ascended above the horizon, Cullen's modified Sherman advanced towards a particularly dense hedgerow designated for the test. It stood as a formidable barrier, 12 feet in height, ancient and seemingly impenetrable. Several officers had assembled to observe, including Captain Morrison and Major Jack Williams from Division Headquarters. The Sherman's crew had voluntarily enlisted for the trial. Driver Corporal Jake Mitchell, Gunner Sergeant Tom Harrison, and Loader Private First Class Danny Chin. Their bravery was undeniable, perhaps bordering on recklessness. As they secured their hatches and the engine vibrated to life, a profound silence descended upon the assembled soldiers. Cullen stood with the observers, his heart pounding intensely. Everything he had calculated, everything he had constructed, hinged on the ensuing 60 seconds. If it succeeded, they would revolutionize the Normandy campaign. If it failed catastrophically, innocent lives might be lost, and he would be directly responsible. "Ready?" Morrison inquired, looking towards Cullen. "As I shall ever be, sir." Morrison raised his arm, then lowered it, signaling commencement. The Sherman's engine roared with increased intensity. Black smoke billowed from its exhaust. Then, with rapidly accumulating velocity, it charged directly at the hedgerow. 30 tons of steel accelerating towards an immovable object. The impact resonated with a deafening boom. The entire tank shuddered violently. Earth erupted outwards. Roots snapped with reports akin to rifle fire. For a fleeting moment, The tank appeared to stall, deeply embedded within the hedgerow's mass. Soldiers held their breath. Then, gradually, the Sherman began to advance. The steel prongs were performing their intended function. They were penetrating the ancient earthwork with significant depth, generating leverage and severing through roots and stone. The tank tilted slightly forward, maintaining its frontal armor orientation and avoiding exposure of its underside to any potential threats. Additional roots fractured. Dirt cascaded off the tank's hull. The engine strained audibly. And then, with abruptness, the Sherman breached the hedgerow, emerging into the adjacent field. The tank had successfully created a perfectly formed aperture, sufficiently wide to accommodate subsequent vehicles, and low enough to prevent the tank's vulnerable underbelly from ever being exposed. The assembled soldiers erupted in joyous acclamation. Cullen felt a profound sense of relief wash over him, rendering his knees weak. It had worked. His unconventional concept had, in fact, succeeded. The Sherman's crew opened their hatches and emerged, their faces alight with triumphant grins. "That was the smoothest hedgerow crossing I've ever experienced," Corporal Mitchell exclaimed. "We barely registered the impact internally, and our belly was never once exposed to enemy fire." Major Williams approached Cullen, his demeanor serious. "Sergeant, what is the potential production rate for these modifications, and how rapidly can you achieve it?" "Sir, if I am provided with sufficient welders and access to additional hedgehog obstacles, my crew could modify 10 tanks per day. Possibly more if we exert maximum effort." "That is insufficient," Williams stated, causing Cullen's heart to sink. Then the Major's expression softened into a smile. "I shall procure 50 welders for you and all the necessary steel. I require 100 tanks to be modified by the week's end. Furthermore, I am dispatching an immediate report to General Bradley. This innovation is poised to revolutionize our operations." Captain Morrison clapped Cullen heartily on the back. "Congratulations, Sergeant! You are no longer the eccentric mechanic. You are the brilliant mechanic who has just secured the success of the Normandy campaign." However, Cullen was not yet ready to celebrate. "Sir, with all due respect, a single successful trial does not guarantee efficacy in combat. We must test this against an actual German emplacement under live enemy fire. That is the sole means to definitively ascertain its effectiveness." Morrison nodded grimly. "I anticipated such a response. There is a German strongpoint approximately 2 miles from our current position. They have effectively halted our advance for 3 days. The battalion intends to neutralize it, but all approach routes are obstructed by hedgerows. Every attempt to breach these barriers has proven suicidal. If your modification performs successfully under fire in that location, it will validate your concept beyond any shadow of a doubt." "When shall we proceed, sir?" "Tomorrow at dawn. I am assigning you to the tank as a technical advisor. You will accompany Mitchell's crew. Should any issues arise, you must be present to observe and comprehend their nature." Cullen swallowed hard. He had harbored a desire to remain at the fabrication facility and concentrate on constructing additional modifications. However, Morrison's reasoning was sound. He needed to witness his invention in genuine combat conditions. Only then could he determine if the design required further refinements. Only then could he credibly declare it ready for mass production. "Understood, sir. I shall be prepared." That night, Cullen meticulously re-examined every weld on the modified Sherman. He tightened bolts and inspected the prongs for any signs of stress fractures resulting from the test. Everything appeared robust, yet combat presented a vastly different scenario than a controlled demonstration. In battle, nothing ever unfolded precisely as planned. Private Chen found him working late under lantern light. "Sergeant, you should get some rest. It's a significant day tomorrow." "I cannot sleep, Chen. Too much contemplation." "Are you apprehensive?" Cullen considered offering a deceptive reassurance, but ultimately opted for candor. "Terrified. This concept is sound in theory. It performed admirably in a single trial, but tomorrow lives will depend on the accuracy of my calculations. If I have erred inadvertently, or if there is a design flaw I have overlooked. We trust you have observed everything, Chen stated simply. You constructed this apparatus. You understand it better than anyone. And tomorrow, we shall breach those hedgerows and demonstrate to the Germans that they can no longer conceal themselves. Cullen wished he possessed Chen's unwavering confidence, but his only recourse was to prepare to the best of his ability and hope that his audacious concept was indeed genius. Tomorrow would represent the true test. Dawn broke over Normandy, accompanied by a chilling drizzle, casting a somber gray hue over the landscape. Cullen ascended into the Sherman tank, assuming a position in the commander's cupola, enabling him to observe and provide technical guidance to the crew. His stomach churned with nervous anticipation. The plan was straightforward. Their tank, now affectionately designated the Rhinoceros by the crew, would lead a small contingent towards the German strongpoint. They would utilize the hedgerow cutter to breach the barriers that had previously impeded all advances. Infantry units would follow closely behind, exploiting the breaches to advance without becoming entangled in the deadly kill zones established by the German forces. "Mount up," came the order. Engines roared to life across the staging area. The Rhinoceros shuddered and began its forward movement, its steel prongs gleaming wetly in the dim dawn light. They approached the initial hedgerow. Beyond it, according to intelligence reports, lay a German machine gun nest that had been decimating American infantry for days. The conventional tactic would involve attempting to ascend the hedgerow, thereby exposing the tank's underside to a German Panzer, a portable anti-tank weapon capable of penetrating weak armor with ease. "Steady," Cullen advised over the intercom. "Engage at a slight angle, approximately 20 degrees. This will assist the prongs in achieving a firm grip." "Roger that," Corporal Mitchell replied, adjusting their approach. The impact registered with a bone-jarring crash. Earth and roots exploded outwards. Inside the tank, the crew was jolted forward against their restraints, but nothing yielded. The prongs remained intact. The tank surged forward, its engine screaming, tracks churning, tearing through vegetation that had grown for centuries. And then they emerged on the other side, encountering a startled German machine gun crew scrambling to orient their weapon. The Sherman's main gun discharged first. A single high-explosive round incapacitated the threat before the Germans could effectively react. "It's working!" Chen exclaimed over the intercom. "It's actually working in combat." However, there was no time for celebration. Additional hedgerows lay ahead, and behind each one could be enemy combatants. The Rhinoceros continued its advance, breaching hedgerow after hedgerow. Each time, the prongs performed flawlessly. Each time, the tank emerged before the German forces could bring their anti-tank weaponry to bear. The accompanying infantry, following in the wake of the Rhinoceros, expressed profound elation. For the first time since D-Day, they could advance without being pinned down by entrenched hedgerow defenses. They poured through the breaches meticulously created by the tank, neutralizing German positions that had appeared utterly impregnable mere hours prior. Then came the ultimate test. Intelligence reports had warned of a German Panther tank, a far more formidable adversary than infantry positioned behind a particularly formidable hedgerow. The Panther's 75mm cannon possessed the capability to obliterate a Sherman at considerable range. Should the Rhinoceros become immobilized while breaching the hedgerow, it would become an easy target. "Contact front," Harrison reported. "Panther partially concealed behind the hedgerow." Cullen's mind raced. They could retreat, request artillery support, opt for the cautious approach. But that represented adherence to antiquated tactics. The very essence of his invention was to fundamentally alter the established protocols. "Breach the hedgerow," Cullen commanded. "Do not cease for any reason. We advance rapidly. We emerge with our cannon already aimed at the Panther's position. Speed is our definitive advantage." Mitchell responded without hesitation. The Sherman surged forward. The impact was immense. This hedgerow was more substantial than any they had previously encountered. For a terrifying moment, the tank's momentum appeared to wane, the prongs struggling against the dense mass. "More power," Cullen shouted. "Engage at maximum capacity." The engine roared. Smoke billowed from the exhausts. The tracks churned up vast clouds of earth, and inch by painstaking inch, the rhinoceros forced its way through. They burst through the hedgerow at an angle, not perfect, but sufficiently effective. Harrison had maintained his gun sights trained on the projected location of the Panther, and as they emerged, there it was, its turret rotating to track their unexpected appearance. Harrison fired first. The armor-piercing round struck the Panther's side armor, which was less substantial than its frontal plating, and penetrated. The German tank lurched violently, smoke emanating from its hatches. Its crew bailed out, and the rhinoceros's machine guns persuaded them to surrender rather than engage further. The infantry caught up, securing the German prisoners. An officer approached the rhinoceros, a broad grin on his face. "Sergeant Cullen, I cannot fathom the arcane methods you employed on this tank, but you have achieved in 2 hours what we have been striving to accomplish for 3 days. That German strongpoint is neutralized." Cullen disembarked from the tank, his legs trembling. He had succeeded. The design had proven effective not merely in a controlled experiment, but in actual combat against genuine enemy positions under active fire. His audacious concept had validated itself. Captain Morrison arrived shortly thereafter, his radio crackling with reports from various units. "Sergeant, I have just received communication from division headquarters. General Bradley himself wishes to meet with you. Apparently, Major Williams's report has generated considerable interest. They are referring to your invention as the Cullen hedgerow cutter, and they have mandated the immediate manufacture of 5,000 units. 5,000! Cullen struggled to comprehend the sheer magnitude of the number. His minor alteration, fashioned in 48 hours from salvaged metal, was slated for mass fabrication and widespread deployment across the entirety of the Allied armored force. "Sir, I'm merely a mechanic. I'm uncertain if I should be—" "You are the individual who surmounted the hedgerow obstacle," Morrison interjected. "Take ownership of it, Sergeant. You have just fundamentally reshaped the conflict." The Sherman's engine emitted a more potent rumble. Dark smoke billowed from its interior within days of the rhinoceros's successful combat engagement. Every tank maintenance facility in Normandy received directives to commence the installation of Cullen hedgerow cutters. The military enlisted welding specialists from engineering battalions. They retrieved additional Czech hedgerow obstacles from the shorelines. They established production lines in open fields, operating continuously. Cullen found himself reassigned from his unit and tasked with instructing welding crews. He traveled from one facility to another, demonstrating the precise angles for the tines, the appropriate welding procedures, and the reinforcement techniques that would prevent the cutters from fracturing under strain. The crucial element, he expounded to each new cohort of welders, is that the tines must engage low to the ground. If they are positioned too high, the tank will ascend, exposing its vulnerable underside. If they are too low, they will simply displace soil without severing roots. You require them precisely at this juncture. He would demarcate the spot with chalk, indicating a 15-degree downward inclination. This achieves optimal cutting efficiency. Some welders initially exhibited skepticism. The design appeared rudimentary, merely steel tines affixed to a tank. However, upon witnessing combat footage of rhinoceros tanks effortlessly traversing hedgerows that had obstructed all other vehicles, their skepticism transformed into eagerness. They accelerated their pace, taking immense pride in the modifications they were implementing. General Omar Bradley personally visited one of the tank modification sites. He discovered Cullen deeply immersed in a welding task, instructing a new team. "Sergeant Cullen, I presume?" Hudlin snapped to attention, recognizing the insignia on Bradley's uniform. "Yes, sir." "At ease, Sergeant. I've come to meet the individual who liberated my army." Bradley offered a smile. "Your invention is brilliant in its sheer simplicity. We have been confronting the hedgerow challenge with complex engineering solutions for weeks. Artillery barges, explosive charges, modified bulldozers. None proved consistently effective. And then you appear with scrap metal and a welding torch, resolving it in 2 days. Sir, I simply did what was necessary. Bradley concluded. That is the essence of a good soldier. I am recommending you for the Legion of Merit and am also authorizing a battlefield promotion to technical sergeant. This army requires more individuals capable of unconventional thinking. Following Bradley's departure, Cullen's comrades swarmed him with felicitations. However, Cullen experienced a sense of internal conflict. He was being lauded as a visionary, receiving accolades and advancements, yet men continued to perish in Normandy. His creation was proving beneficial, but it was not a panacea. The war was far from concluded. Private Kowalski, who had assisted with the initial prototype, approached him discreetly. "Are you all right, Sarge? You don't seem particularly enthusiastic about all of this." "I am, Eddie. I can't stop thinking about all the crews we lost before this invention. What if I had conceived of it sooner? What if I had exerted more pressure to have it tested?" "You cannot dwell on such possibilities," Kowalski stated firmly. "You cannot rescue those who have already perished, but you are safeguarding those who remain alive. Each day, more tanks equipped with your cutters are advancing through hedgerows. Each day, fewer crews are being incinerated. That is what truly signifies progress." Cullen understood Kowalski's logic, yet the burden of guilt persisted. In moments of solitude, he would reflect on the tank crews who perished attempting to surmount hedgerows in those initial weeks following D-Day. If only he had worked with greater haste. If only he had been more insistent. If only. But war afforded no such luxuries as if only. It demanded continuous forward momentum, persistent problem-solving, and an unwavering effort to rescue whomever possible in the present. As the Cullen hedgerow cutters were increasingly utilized, soldiers in the field began submitting reports with their own suggestions and modifications. The cutter performed exceptionally well, but there was always scope for enhancement. Some crews discovered that incorporating a fifth tine in the center improved their cutting efficacy on particularly dense hedgerows. Others experimented with serrated edges on the tines, which assisted in gripping and tearing through stubborn root systems. A few resourceful tank commanders added protective plating to shield the welds from enemy small arms fire. Cullen readily embraced all these advancements. He had never contended that his design was flawless, merely that it functioned. If soldiers in the field could refine it, he was eager to learn from their experiences. The most ingenious ideas originate from the individuals actively employing the equipment, he explained to a visiting war correspondent. "I conceived of the fundamental concept, but dozens of tank crews have contributed refinements. This is no longer solely my invention. It belongs to every soldier who has improved it." One particularly clever adaptation emerged from a tank crew within the 3rd Armored Division. They observed that the cutters sometimes became obstructed by compacted earth and roots, diminishing their effectiveness on subsequent hedgerows. They devised a straightforward mechanism, inspired by agricultural harrowing equipment, that automatically cleared debris from the tines as the tank advanced. It was a minor alteration, yet it enabled tanks to breach multiple hedgerows consecutively without necessitating a halt to manually clear the cutters. Chin promptly integrated this enhancement into his instructional programs for new installations. "Observe, that is pure ingenuity," he would remark to the welding crews. "I never considered debris clearance. Some tanker in the field identified the issue and resolved it. This is how effective engineering progresses, iteratively, with input from those directly utilizing the product." The German reaction to the hedgerow cutters was noteworthy. Initially, they appeared perplexed by the Allies' sudden capacity to breach hedgerows. German after-action reports recovered later in the war revealed considerable bewilderment. Enemy armor is now traversing hedgerows without exposing vulnerable sectors. The method employed is unknown. Once they deciphered the situation, the Germans implemented various countermeasures. They attempted to fortify hedgerows with concealed mines. They positioned anti-tank guns at angles that might intercept breaching tanks. They even constructed artificial hedgerows as traps, with pre-positioned anti-tank weaponry awaiting attacking tanks. But none of these countermeasures proved consistently effective. The fundamental challenge remained. The CQIN cutter enabled tanks to breach hedgerows while maintaining their heavily armored frontal aspect towards the enemy. As long as Allied tank crews employed sound tactical principles, the Germans were incapable of effectively countering this new capability. By August of 1944, as Allied forces broke free from Normandy and commenced their rapid advance across France, the hedgerow cutters had become standard equipment. New Sherman tanks rolling off production lines in the United States were manufactured with attachment points for the cutters already welded in place. The field modification had evolved into an official component of tank design. Cullen had, in essence, revolutionized the manufacturing process of tanks. As Allied forces pushed beyond Normandy into the more open landscapes of inland France, the hedgerow cutters were employed less for their initial intended purpose. However, tank crews swiftly discovered that the cutters possessed other applications that had not been foreseen. In urban combat scenarios, the steel tines proved exceptionally effective for demolishing brick walls and wooden barricades. Tank crews utilized them to breach structures where German snipers were entrenched. The psychological impact was devastating. The sheer sound of a 30-ton tank smashing through a wall was sufficient to persuade numerous German defenders to surrender rather than engage in further resistance. During river crossings, crews found that the cutters provided enhanced traction when tanks were required to ascend muddy riverbanks. The tines dug into the slick soil, preventing the vehicles from sliding backward during critical maneuvers. In winter warfare, the cutters aided in pushing through snowdrifts that would have otherwise immobilized the vehicles. They functioned akin to colossal snowplows, clearing pathways for advancing troops and equipment. Cullen, now a master sergeant attached to an engineering evaluation team, traveled to various units to study these innovative applications. He meticulously documented observations, sketched modifications, and proposed design enhancements based on his field assessments. "I never envisioned my hedgerow cutters being utilized in such diverse ways," he conveyed in a letter home. "My sole objective was to penetrate the Norman hedgerows. But soldiers exhibit remarkable creativity. They will adapt any tool to serve their needs. My cutters have evolved into versatile battlefield instruments." The most surprising application arose during the Battle of the Bulge in December of 1944. German forces, launching their final significant offensive, had erected extensive roadblocks using felled trees to impede Allied counterattacks. Tank crews discovered that the hedgerow cutters could displace or shatter these tree obstacles, enabling armored columns to sustain their momentum even when roads were blocked. One after-action report detailed a Sherman crew using their cutter to physically push a disabled German tank from a narrow roadway, clearing the path for an entire American column to advance. The cutter tines engaged under the German tank's skirt armor, the report stated, and with considerable effort, our Sherman managed to shift the obstruction. This unconventional deployment of the hedgerow cutter averted a multi-hour delay that could have jeopardized our tactical objectives. Cullen found that particular account rather amusing. "I engineered a device to cut through shrubbery," he would remark, "and now they are employing it to reposition immobilized armored vehicles. Warfare certainly fosters ingenuity, I suppose." However, not all developments were favorable. Certain tanks experienced equipment malfunctions when the cutters were employed beyond their designed operational parameters. Tines fractured when tanks attempted to power through reinforced concrete barriers. Welds failed when crews attempted to utilize the cutters for lifting heavy objects. There were even instances of friendly fire incidents when other units, operating in poor visibility, failed to recognize modified tanks and mistook the silhouette of the tines for enemy equipment. Cullen collaborated with Army engineers to develop enhanced training materials. The cutter is a tool, not a magical artifact, he emphasized during training sessions. It possesses limitations. Misuse it, and you risk damaging it or causing fatalities. Employ it correctly, and it will preserve your life and ensure mission accomplishment. By early 1945, as Allied forces advanced into Germany itself, the hedgerow cutter had become such a standard piece of equipment that new tankers could barely recall a time when Shermans were not outfitted with them. The innovation had become integrated into standard doctrine and operational procedures. For Cullen, this brought a blend of satisfaction and a subtle melancholy. His invention had triumphed beyond his most ambitious expectations. Yet, this success meant that individuals began to forget it had ever been a significant challenge. The hedgerow cutters were simply present, an intrinsic part of the tank. Unremarkable. That is how you know something has truly succeeded, Captain Morrison remarked to him. When people cannot envision a time when it was different. You did not merely resolve an issue, Crougen. You eradicated the problem so completely that its very existence is now forgotten. Not every facet of the hedgerow cutter's success narrative was positive. There were associated costs and ramifications that Cullen had not fully anticipated. The initial human cost was significant. As tanks acquired the ability to breach hedgerows with increased speed, infantry commanders began to employ armor more aggressively. Certain assaults that might have been postponed or canceled in the pre-cutter era were now initiated with the expectation that tanks could overcome hedgerow obstacles. This led to some units being propelled into situations resulting in casualties that greater prudence might have averted. Cullen grappled with this guilt. Did I provide commanders with a tool that fostered overconfidence? He mused aloud to Chaplain Thomas O'Brien during a rare moment of introspection. You furnished them with a tool that preserved lives, O'Brien responded gently. The tactical choices commanders made with that instrument rest with them, not with you. You cannot dictate how individuals utilize your creations. Your role is to endeavor to produce things that yield more benefit than harm. Then there was the matter of the German defenders. The hedgerow cutters undeniably hastened the Normandy campaign, thereby saving Allied lives. However, it also meant that German soldiers who might have survived a more protracted, cautious Allied advance were instead killed during the accelerated push facilitated by the cutters. Cullen understood this intellectually. It was the nature of warfare. The objective was to vanquish the enemy. Yet emotionally, it proved more difficult to process. I caused the deaths of individuals I never encountered, he confided to Kowalski one evening. Not directly, but my invention positioned tanks in a manner that enabled them to inflict greater casualties. I am being recognized for that. Medals for making killing more efficient? It feels inherently wrong. Kowalski was silent for a moment. Do you know what feels wrong to me? Watching good men perish inside tanks because we couldn't breach hedgerows without exposing ourselves. You put an end to that. Yes, your invention resulted in German fatalities. It is a weapon modification. That is its intended function. But it also saved American lives. More importantly, it shortened the war. Every day this war continues, lives are lost. Americans, Germans, French civilians caught in the crossfire. Your invention helped bring it to a swifter conclusion. That preserves lives on all sides, even if it doesn't feel that way. Cullen desired to believe this. He needed to believe it. Yet the moral calculus of warfare was never straightforward. There was also a practical expenditure that had not been foreseen: strain on the supply chain. The rapid Allied advance, enabled by the hedgerow cutters, meant that logistical support could not always keep pace. Fuel, ammunition, and spare parts had to be rapidly transported to units that had suddenly advanced miles beyond planners' expectations. Some units depleted their supplies and were compelled to halt their progress, creating tactical vulnerabilities. Cullen found himself in meetings with logistics officers, endeavoring to explain that the success of his invention had generated challenges they needed to address. "I provided you with a device that enhances tank effectiveness," he would articulate. Now, you must devise a strategy to sustain these tanks as they advance, at a pace exceeding all prior projections. It was an unusual position for an enlisted sergeant to offer advice to officers on strategic planning. However, his unique perspective as the inventor commanded attention. The Army adapted, developing new logistical procedures and supply methodologies to accommodate the accelerated operational tempo that the hedgerow cutters facilitated. Perhaps the most peculiar cost was psychological. Chin achieved notoriety within the Army, hailed as the ingenious mechanic who had solved an insurmountable problem. Soldiers sought his autograph. Officers desired his presence at their briefings. War correspondents requested interviews. He detested it. "I am not comfortable with this," he confessed to Morrison. "I am merely an individual who had an idea. I did not storm a beach or charge a machine gun nest. I simply welded some metal onto a tank. Why am I being treated as a hero when genuine heroes are dying daily?" Morrison understood. "You feel uncomfortable because you are modest, which is admirable. But here is what you must comprehend. Those soldiers charging machine gun nests are heroes due to their valor. You are a hero because of your intellect. Both forms of heroism are essential for victory in war. Accept it, Sergeant. You have earned it." Reluctantly, Cullen learned to accept the recognition, though he never became entirely at ease with it. In his own estimation, he remained simply a mechanic from New Jersey who had figured out how to cut through shrubbery. Germany capitulated on the 8th of May, 1945. The war in Europe had concluded. Cullen stood with his unit in a small German town, observing the soldiers' celebrations. There was elation, relief, weariness, a complex tapestry of emotions difficult to articulate. The hedgerow cutters had played a role in the triumph. By most estimations, they had shortened the Normandy campaign by weeks, possibly months. That acceleration had far-reaching consequences. A swifter advance across France, the earlier liberation of Paris, a quicker crossing of the Rhine, an expedited arrival in Berlin. Each day saved translated into lives preserved, resources conserved, and suffering alleviated. Official commendations credited the Cullen hedgerow cutter with making a substantial contribution to the successful conclusion of the Normandy campaign and subsequent operations. Within the European theater, General Eisenhower himself had lauded it as one of the most significant tactical innovations of the war. Chin received the Legion of Merit, the Bronze Star, and a commendation from the Supreme Allied Commander. He was promoted to warrant officer. His name appeared in newspapers back home. He became a symbol of American ingenuity, the common soldier who had employed practical sense and salvaged materials to resolve an issue that had perplexed experts. However, as he stood in that German town, witnessing the festivities, Ken felt an emptiness. The problem he had solved no longer held relevance. The war was over. The hedgerows of Normandy were a year in the past. His invention, as revolutionary as it had been, was now merely a historical footnote in a conflict that had claimed tens of millions of lives. "You are contemplating too deeply once more," Kowalski observed, appearing beside him with 2 bottles of liberated German beer. "Just reflecting," Cullen replied, accepting a bottle. "A year ago, I was welding tines onto a tank, hoping my idea would prove effective. Now the war has ended, and I am trying to ascertain the ultimate significance of it all." "It meant you saved lives," Kowalski stated simply. "My life, quite possibly. I was in the infantry before being transferred to your welding crew. Had I remained in the infantry, had tanks been unable to breach hedgerows, I would likely be deceased, along with hundreds of other men. Your invention made a profound difference, Sarge. Never doubt that." They drank in silence, observing the sunset over a ravaged Germany. Kin considered the multitude of decisions that had culminated in this moment. If he had dismissed his initial concept as too simplistic, if Morrison had withheld approval, if the initial test had proven unsuccessful, If the combat trial had encountered complications, any one of those junctures could have altered everything. "Do you know what strikes me as peculiar?" Cullen inquired after a pause. "I frequently think about the German tankers. They were situated behind hedgerows, confident in their security. Then, abruptly, American tanks were breaching barriers that were presumed to be impregnable." What must that have felt like, to have the rules of warfare fundamentally altered overnight? "Likely felt like defeat," Kowalski responded, "which is what they deserved for initiating this entire catastrophe." Cullen nodded, but the thought lingered. The conflict was replete with innovations, with each side perpetually striving for an advantage, to surprise the adversary, to redefine the parameters of engagement. His hedgerow cutter was but a single instance. Countless others existed: radar, proximity fuses, enhanced armor, refined tactics. Each innovation rendered an opponent's defensive posture obsolete, their meticulous preparations rendered futile. Such was the inherent nature of warfare. Yet it also mirrored the trajectory of progress. When one successfully resolves a problem within a conflict, one is not merely defeating the adversary. One is demonstrating that problems are surmountable, that human ingenuity possesses the capacity to overcome obstacles that appear insurmountable. "I wonder what will become of all those cutters now," Cullen mused. "Thousands of tanks with my tines welded in place. What becomes of them when there are no longer hedgerows to traverse?" "They'll likely be scrapped," Kowalski stated, "or left attached as mementos. In either case, they fulfilled their purpose. That is all any tool can reasonably expect." Curtis Cullen returned to his home in New Jersey in late 1945, bearing commendations and recollections, yet eager to leave the war behind. He resumed his former occupation, repairing automobiles and trucks in a modest garage. The skills that had propelled him to wartime innovation served him equally well in peacetime. He possessed a natural aptitude for machinery, a talent for problem solving, and an ability to perceive solutions that eluded others. However, he rarely spoke of the hedgerow cutter. When acquaintances or companions inquired about his wartime experiences, he would skillfully sidestep the topic. "I was merely a mechanic, repairing tanks, nothing extraordinary," he'd claim. He omitted any mention of the commendations he received, the innovative solutions he devised, or the pivotal role his creation played in shaping the outcome of the Normandy campaign. His wife, Margaret, once questioned his reticence to recount his wartime accomplishments. "You're a true hero," she'd stated. "You ought to be proud." "I'm proud of my contributions," Cullen responded softly, "but I'm not proud of the purpose behind them. I fashioned a device that facilitated killing. It did preserve American lives, which is significant, but its fundamental purpose was destruction. I'd rather dedicate my efforts to mending things now, rather than dwelling on how I contributed to breaking them then." Through the ensuing decades, military scholars gradually came to appreciate the significance of the Cullen hedgerow cutter. It featured prominently in chronicles of the Normandy campaign, in documentaries exploring wartime innovations, and within military training curricula as an illustration of battlefield engineering ingenuity. However, Ken himself remained largely an obscure figure, known primarily within academic military history circles. In 1984, 40 years after D-Day, a budding historian named David Carter managed to locate Cullen, then 73 years old and long retired. Carter was in the process of writing a book on tactical advancements during World War II and was eager to interview the originator of the hedgerow cutter. "Mr. Cullen, do you realize the profound impact of your invention?" Carter inquired during their conversation. "Military strategists estimate it shortened the Normandy campaign by several weeks. It saved thousands of lives. It fundamentally altered the strategic doctrine of tank warfare, and it all originated with you, a sergeant without an engineering degree, in a mere 48 hours." Cullen remained silent for a considerable pause. Then he articulated something that Carter would later include in his book as the quintessential representation of American innovation. "I wasn't exceptional. I was simply an individual who understood mechanics and identified a problem requiring a solution. The truly exceptional aspect was that the military provided me with the opportunity to pursue it. How many other valuable concepts were dismissed because they originated from an unconventional source? How many challenges went unresolved because someone declared it was outside established procedures? I was fortunate. My unconventional idea was tested. But I can assure you, there were hundreds of other fellows with equally sound ideas whom no one bothered to hear. But your idea proved successful, Carter pressed. That's what makes you exceptional. My idea succeeded because people were willing to give it a chance, Cullen corrected. Captain Morrison could have easily refused. The testing unit could have declined participation. The division leadership could have rejected it after the initial combat evaluation, but they didn't. They assessed the concept itself, not the individual proposing it. That's the genuine takeaway. Not that I was some sort of genius, but rather that valuable ideas can emerge from any quarter if one is open to listening. Curtis Cullen passed away in 1963. His obituary in the local newspaper noted his occupation as a mechanic, his status as a veteran, and his reserved nature, preferring to mend rather than to discuss. It made no mention of the hedgerow cutter. The majority of his neighbors remained unaware that the man who had repaired their vehicles had played a role in altering the course of World War II. However, in military repositories across America and Europe, specimens of the Cullen hedgerow cutter are meticulously preserved. These are sections of steel affixed to the frontal plating of Sherman tanks. They appear simple and rudimentary, yet were revolutionary in their efficacy. Informative plaques describe their purpose and their impact. And occasionally, they bear the name Curtis Cullen, the unconventional mechanic who refused to accept that certain problems were insurmountable.